Okay, I guess we can start our call. I'm sure there'll be some colleagues who will join us. I mean, that we may have colleagues who will join us late, but let's start. I'm Pierre Havard, General Secretary of the Trade Union Advisory Committee. I'm very pleased to introduce this webinar on a very easy and narrow topic. Question: what kind of sustainable economic model post COVID-19? That's a question that we'll ask today, and we have 1 hour and 30 minutes to answer that question, so to speak. More seriously, this is part of a series of webinars that the TUAC is organizing, planning since the beginning, since the outbreak of the pandemic. With always the same intent, which is to benefit from the OECD expertise and the OECD expertise and experience, and to confront that with a trade union perspective and a trade union reality. So for this webinar, I'll introduce the speaker, but before that, a few comments on precisely this sustainable economic model post-COVID-19 that we want. There are within the labor movement a number of forums, initiatives, and outside the labor movement as well, on the model of growth that we want after the crisis. And this webinar is a contribution to that. In general, I guess there's this, whatever the direction we take in the future, I think there's a common understanding that it should not be back to business as usual, and for a number of reasons. One of them is that this crisis, this pandemic, piles on a number of other crises that have been looming over the past 10 years for some of them. The OECD is doing its job, if I may, in informing us, in providing policy recommendations, and has done incredible work over the past 6 months with a number of policy briefs, thematic specific policy briefs. But as you well know, the OECD is also, like another party, engaging a more long-term perspective, long-term discussion on the economic challenges. And after the 2008 crisis, it launched a very welcome initiative called the NIKE initiative, New Approaches to Economic Challenges. In the most recent publication, a report calling for moving beyond growth, we spotted a simple but fairly telling statement. Many of the policies implemented over the last 40 years or so are no longer able to improve economic and social outcomes in the way they once promised. So that's a very general statement. It can be interpreted in many ways, and perhaps that will be our job to help fine-tune and give a concrete interpretation, one that is inclusive, one that has respect for social justice, among others. On the labor side, I said there are many initiatives, many bright people who are active and trying to inform this discussion and this debate. And for this today's session, I'm very pleased to introduce two speakers. First is William Hines, who is the head of the New Approaches to Economic Challenges initiative. So welcome, William. William, you've been steering this process, this initiative, this program for a number of years now, and you will be able to provide us a bit of a perspective on the discussion on Beyond Growth. And Jeff Tidey, senior economist at the Trade Union Congress, the British TUC. Jeff, you are, if I may, you're very active. Well, I'm sure within the TUC, but within the TUAC and within the our working group on economic policy, which will be meeting tomorrow and on Friday. And if I may, Jeff, I don't want to anticipate on your presentation, but you are calling for a renewed internationalism of labor in opposition to capital globalization, and one that can reverse a shift from capital liberalization to bread and butter matters for us, strengthening labor and the wage share, which, as we know, the wage share national income, which as we know has been decreasing. I've been speaking too much. I leave it there. We'll now listen first to William, and then to Jeff, and then we will have, I'm sure, a good opportunity for a good Q&A. William, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Pierre. And thanks also to Philippe for organizing this. And I think it's a very important and interesting discussion. It's great for NIC to be involved. Pierre, in your opening remarks, you said that the point of this was to benefit from the OECD. And Paul Krugman once described the OECD as conventional wisdom central. That, and he actually meant it as a compliment. He said, you need a place where people can come together and have shared and common understanding about the way things work and can agree consensual approaches to some of our great questions. But he also described the new approaches to economic challenges effort as a kind of a skunk works for economic policy, a place where we could experiment, critique, think about things, and maybe come up with new ways of looking at our issues and new policies on that basis. And NIC has been described in many different ways. Just last week, Rana Foroohar from the Financial Times described it as the most important conversation building in the world today, which was very good. On the other hand, there's also negative descriptions. There was a blog last week describing NIC as helping out with the assisted suicide of OECD economics. So not so good, that one. And probably my favorite description was from Avner Offer from Oxford, who described NIC as a kind of intellectual red light zone. So all sorts of things can go on in NIC, but let's keep it walled off from the real discussion at OECD. And I'd like to perhaps challenge that a little bit. But today the discussion is post-COVID-19 economic models. And the context we're all familiar with. COVID, there's a lot of talk about post-COVID world and all this stuff. But I think what I'd like to, my first point really is that COVID just reveals the world as it really is. It's a world that's incredibly complex. It's interconnected. There are shocks that can occur at a local level and can scale up to the global context. And this is the first of many shocks we can expect to come. And the way we've approached economics, in a way, is not built for dealing with shocks. It's not dealing for a world that is continually subject to these types of failures. And so we need to rethink the model that underlies a lot of our economics and the economics itself, that it needs to be a lot more interdisciplinary. I think we need to look at disciplines which are actually used to dealing with more complex systems. We need to think a lot more about people and behavior, because we, at least rhetorically, we say we want people at the center. But if it's a stripped down version of individuals as essentially being economic man who are easy to understand and make choices based on rationality and optimize utility, okay, that's one way of looking at it, but we probably need a lot more to understand why people react the way they do to changing circumstances. Why are they so loss averse? Why do they have trouble in some cases following rules? We need to integrate all this complexity into understanding people. But I would also say that when we've talked about NIC and the idea of fixing up our economic frameworks and being more interdisciplinary and having more realistic ways of thinking about things, that a lot of people will say, well, this isn't about economics, it's about politics. And economics has been used in a way that has justified a political paradigm. And so therefore just fixing up the economics profession is not going to be enough. And I have some sympathy with that. But we did it. We managed to break the world. And I think COVID revealed that. This was an article by Tom Friedman in the New York Times. And it really showed that with COVID, it started off as a health crisis. But then we had these cascading failures. Global value chains went down. We had to reorient industrial strategy to produce the things we needed in an emergency. We have multilateralism. It hasn't been its finest hour. We weren't able to come together to deal with some of these collective action problems. The social consequences have been extreme. And so we really need to think about the shock, because this has been coming. And what's changed perhaps is what we've been doing in economic policy and policy in general, where we've really been removing all of these buffers, redundancies, regulations, norms, and the resilience and protection within the big systems that are all interacting. We're all trying to optimize them, and they will fail. And this is a wake-up call in many ways. And just last week, we had a discussion with Niall Ferguson, the historian, who sort of melds a very smooth narrative about doom in his latest book, coupled with some climate denial, which obviously I don't think is a good thing, but he presents it so well. But he basically said the problem with doom and scenarios like COVID is that politicians, policymakers, business people are essentially all playing for time. They're just hoping it happens on someone else's watch. So let's maximize efficiency, let's maximize profits, let's boost the GDP numbers as much as we can. And if it all falls apart, let's just hope it doesn't happen on our watch. But I think the idea that we've built a system based on short-term efficiency and growth is probably accurate. And many people on the business side or from certain countries will say, well, that's a political statement, or that's undermining the role of efficiency. Well, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that efficiency has a role, and in any system, you need to think about its efficiency. But you also need to think about its resilience, its sustainability, its inclusiveness. If it's to be resilient, you need to think about all of these dimensions. And so it's not just that you look at the system and you only think about efficiency. That's the point. It's a pretty innocuous point, but people get upset. So this is the world as it really is. It's a system where heterogeneous global production networks, 50 million firms, billions of physical links, interacting with households, 2 billion households, 3.3 billion workers, trillions of links to consume products, a web of contracts in the trillions, and ownership patterns where a few firms and individuals own almost everything. Well, this, by definition, doesn't sound like a very resilient system. And so we better be very careful about how we design our policies and how we model this and how we understand how it works. It's a complex system. It's intricate, interlinked. We have financial markets, global supply chains, social networks, and a shared ecological foundation. And I think a lot of economic policy was just the idea that if you get the structural policy settings right, then the market will self-organize. And that will lead to economic growth. And if you adapt it a little bit, you can also have inclusive growth. And if you also think a little bit about sustainability and put in some market-based instruments to get the prices right, you can also have a little bit of sustainability too. But this kind of approach, I think, is limited in that it's really trying to, as we say in the Beyond Growth report, fix up the old model, keep it on the road by at least gesturing in the direction of these bigger issues. But these are separate systems with their own logics, their own dynamics, and it's the interaction that we really need to think about. And it's, again, it goes back to the individual level and having an understanding of people and how they interact and engage with others and behave, because it's not just a linear adding up of all the individuals to get a sense of the macro. It's the interaction that's going to create these unstable properties at the macro level. So the reason I think we need to change the economic model is not because of COVID, but it's because there's a whole range of different shocks and cascading failures. And if we think about, policymakers are very concerned about triggers. So this time around it was a pandemic. So now we're talking about how we can scale up the supply of medical equipment and have buffers and stockpiles of medical equipment. So in the future, we'll better be able to deal with pandemics. But the trigger will always be different. It could be a cyber attack. It could be geopolitical tension, natural disasters. The point is that we need to think more about the system and how resilient the system is, how it will reorganize in response to a shock, how much safeguards and buffers do individuals have in terms of work, social welfare, ability to depend on others? All of these things matter. And of course, these risks are amplified by the overarching trends that have, again, destabilized in a way our whole socioeconomic system. And that's inequalities, hyper-complexity of finance, digitalization, concentration of critical capacities. We often act in economics like these things don't matter. These are just associated problems. And that if we solve the central problem of economic growth, then the rest will take care of themselves. But actually, these are a big part of the economic growth discussion. And you might be optimizing your financial system, and that can be generating 25% of your economy, but it can also be generating instabilities. And actually, the finance system, we've just put out a book on the financial system, and really the current state of finance has a lot to do with the underlying social problems that we have, that people have to borrow more just to finance their consumption, that the whole property market also is leading to concentration of wealth, and there's really major fairness issues to be addressed there. But we have the system that is a product of society. It's not just that we have a well-functioning financial system that's independent of the society in which it operates. And I think it's fair to say that the frequency and intensity of these potential shocks will probably increase, but what we should be really caring about is, because of the globalization, digitalization, real-time transactions, the fact that information can move from one part of the globe to another, it's the cascading effect of the failures that can occur now. And that COVID has demonstrated that the response in the financial markets after COVID, it's recovered, but the disconnect is also another problem between the financial markets and the COVID economy. The way that value chains just collapsed in many places because we built them to have very few suppliers. And so if you remove a supplier, a whole network can collapse. So it is thinking about the world economy in terms of networks that is really important. And again, the economic model that we've had based on general equilibrium, we tend to think that, well, shocks will occur, but they'll be like thunderbolts from Zeus. They will emerge. Some sort of exogenous shock is going to hit us. But don't worry, the model is that a shock comes from the outside, but essentially we have self-stabilizing dynamics. A system will converge back to an equilibrium. It's self-stabilizing. So we don't really need to worry about shocks too much because the system has an innate ability to absorb them and to recover. But the types of shocks, again, that we should be worried about are essentially like the weather. The weather changes all by itself. And so crises can emerge from within the system as a product of the system. You interact a few financial firms and it's amazing what sort of crises can emerge. But also it's these broader societal and environmental factors. All of these things are interacting, and stripping it down to a very simple model of general equilibrium, CG or DSG models, where everything is top down and stable and everyone's homogeneous. I mean, there have been attempts to adapt and amend and improve the models, and I think those efforts are fine, but we really need to think about the fundamental basis on which we build these things. There are three camps of economic thinking that have emerged over the last 10 years, which I think are useful just to frame a bit our discussion. Camp one is very small, but very influential, that believe that the neoclassical framework essentially can respond to the criticism raised by the financial crisis, that the framework of self-interested, rationality, equilibrium, efficient markets, it's essentially sound. And it's essentially where we have the human capital invested. So we should basically keep going with this. And this is a very influential view, especially in the OECD. But I think OECD has moved with Camp 2, which is to say that we can fix this. The model is not fundamentally unsound, that we just need to reform the economics profession. So we just need to extend, modify, figure out what was missing. And this is really the kind of inclusive growth, green growth approach. Just on that, the response to the last crisis, the financial crisis in the OECD, was that, well, we should have inclusive and sustainable growth. That'll fix it. And this time our Ministerial Council meeting is about to discuss strong, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient growth. So we've added a few more things in, but actually we've kept the basic framework the same. And this is what Camp 2 is about. It's just continually adding things in, but eventually you'd have to ask whether it's going to collapse under the weight of its contradictions, and that you're really trying to address the deficiency by bolting on new modules, new understandings, new areas. And well, that's an approach. And I think this is where the mainstream is. And there's some things that are probably good. I mean, behavioral and institutional realism, who would be against that? Although I think behavioral economics gets a lot of airplay, but it's something of a dead end to my mind, because essentially what you're trying to do is say that, well, people are more or less rational, but they have these troublesome cognitive constraints, but don't worry, you can correct for that. So in other words, if people's behavior doesn't fit the model, we should change their behavior. That's one approach. Institutions, we know a lot more about them, so we can build in these things. And political economy, market failures, more empirical data. I think all these things are positive developments that we see, and OECD has been keeping pace with these mainstream developments. But there is a Camp 3, and I think NIAC associates itself more with this field. I think this is a minority field, mostly because it's a Camp 3, which is about changing economics that exists largely outside of economics. It's mostly natural scientists and other disciplines that are saying we need to abandon the things like the equilibrium assumption, because there is no system in the universe that is operating like an economic system that moves to an equilibrium. So maybe we should look to other systems, and they have very different dynamics, which have huge implications for how we think about growth. Because if you optimize a complex system in nature or in any setting, then what we tend to see is that an optimized complex system is one that is very fragile. And so in us trying to optimize productivity, innovation, economic growth, we might actually be destabilizing the system and then coming around with our augmented model to try and fix it. But you know, it might be a more fundamental problem. So Camp 3 is really interdisciplinary. It draws on these disciplines, behavioral sciences. It borrows techniques like agent-based approaches, machine learning, etc., from other disciplines. And a lot of its leaders are non-economists. So you can see the political economy, and some of the critiques of economics, like Paul Romer, argued that one of the big problems is essentially the culture of economists, that there's a real deference to authority, which tends to lock in old ideas. And then you have a system of incentives for graduate students, for people trying to publish, that essentially locks in the old approaches. And so a bunch of clever physicists coming up with better answers is not really going to fit in very well to that culture. And econophysics is becoming a big area of study. And the question is always asked, well, there seems to be a lot of physicists who've taken an interest in economics and getting involved in economics, but how many economists are getting involved in physics? I think it's a very small number. So the standard approach that we've more or less been using to underpin our models has been the idea that we need these sound micro foundations. And so we need assumptions. Basically, when we understand the individual, we can scale that up to understand the macro. Then we have the axioms of rationality. We have optimization and isolation. And of course, perfect knowledge. People understand the economy they function in. And we can have representative agency. So if you have a scaled down, stripped down system, then it probably makes sense that you only care about efficiency by definition, because you're interested in the simple system working efficiently. And that's fine, that's perfectly reasonable. The problem is the economy is not a simple standard system, it's a complex system. And here you have a different set of approaches to the economic model. Individual follow simple rules, they adapt, they're not irrational and don't act against their interests. They have limited, largely local information, so they don't have the bigger picture. They can't respond to adjustments and changes in the overall economy. And it's the interaction that counts. So the real point of my presentation is to say that if the 20th century, and as you said, Pierre, over the last 40 years, we followed the idea that it's about competition, flexibility, and if you have the structural policy settings that do that, the market will self-organize in an efficient way. And that was the way of thinking about things in the past. I think in the future, given all of these problems, we need to think a lot more about how we're going to manage these complex systems, how we're going to coordinate between different actors and stakeholders, and how we can ensure the resilience of the system. So does that mean, is that an implication that we need to go beyond growth? Well, this is the study Pierre referred to. It's a group, an advisor group put this together. And the idea was that we need a narrative. We need plausible stories, because nobody was really convinced by empirical findings or an analytical model. We actually need a plausible way of putting together observed facts, the best science, and an alternative to the types of narratives we've had in the past about efficiency, about optimization, about growth. And so we've produced this report. It's basically, the framework is on 3 areas: a new conception of economic progress, new frameworks of economic theory and analysis, and new approaches to economic policy. And so this is in issue number 1, a new conception of economic progress. Here, I think the OECD has actually been quite well ahead. We've done a lot on well-being, trying to look at the richer set of goals that people have. We've thought more about stocks as well as flows, whether it's natural capital, human capital, social capital. And so this richer framework is largely in place, but the problem is, has it really been operationalized? Has it displaced some of the narrower metrics in decision-making? And I think in some countries it probably has, like New Zealand, Iceland, Scotland, places like that. But in other areas, it's still finance ministries and central banks that are still wedded to the idea that it should be about economic growth. And we haven't displaced that, and should be realistic about that. But it probably makes sense to have this richer framework of measures. The frameworks, again, as I said, there's the field of economics has not been stagnant. There's been a lot of contributions to economic theory analysis. I think a lot in the area of trying to improve the model. But there's also a whole range of other areas. Institutional economics is interesting, I guess. Behavioral complexity economics is a new field. Even thinking about feminist economics and how we need to think about particular actors. So there are new frameworks, and there's new theory and analysis. The new tools have helped a lot. We can simulate a lot more about dynamics and failure. We can look at financial networks, for example, and think about which are the firms that are too connected to fail. We're thinking a lot about inequalities, of course, and we think that inequalities are really the problem. And I wonder if Angus Deaton and Anne Case in their recent book haven't got it right in saying that the problem is not really inequality; it's really a question of fairness. That most people don't mind inequality in general, but what they do mind is the perception that people have benefited or have succeeded in a society and an economy because of essentially rent seeking or taking advantage of monopolization, or that it's not a level playing field. And I think these issues are really also important to think about. So it's the fairness of the system. And do we have too much rent seeking? And what sort of policies have we had that have given rise either to the perception or the reality that we do have too much monopolization, too much concentration of power and wealth in our societies, and what sort of steps could be taken to ameliorate that? And then policy, there's a whole range of different policies, sustainability and decarbonization, where we suggest putting things more on a legal footing, don't rely on market forces alone. Innovation industrial strategy, arguing for much more regional policy and active industrial strategy, which we saw during this crisis, that it was okay to really think about what industry is doing and to intervene, but only, of course, in an emergency situation, only to solve real important problems, and then we can go back to normal, or at least that's the idea. Macro policy, again, I think we've been following quite unorthodox fiscal and monetary policies. MMT, modern monetary theory, is one area that I think we should at least think about. Relaxation of debt ceilings during negative real interest rate seems to be a no-brainer, but surprisingly isn't, but is a lot less controversial this time around than it was after the last crisis. Financial regulation, corporate governance, competition, trade, wealth ownership and taxation, labor markets, higher minimum wages, trade union access to workers, and increasing collective bargaining, regulating insecure work, job guarantees, etc. These are all issues that the advisory group put on the table. It's not to say that Nike advocates these things or says this is the way we should do it. It's more to raise the issues and let's debate them, let's discuss them, and let's see what works. Because often this narrative report has been called by people who oppose it, say, well, it's not evidence-based. And this is also a charge levied against new economic frameworks. They say, well, you know, you don't have the evidence on these things. But it's a bit unfair to give the neoclassical models and approaches a 150-year head start and say, well, these new approaches don't really have, they haven't really been thought out. Well, that's the problem of being new. And a lot of these ideas aren't very new. A lot of these policies were quite mainstream in the 50s and 60s during the golden age of capitalism. But we should really understand what has changed. Because again, some members say, you know, you should just stick to the convention, the OECD convention of 1960s, maximize sustainable growth and all these good things. But growth was a very different thing back then. It had very different impacts. Some of the logic around the Kuznets curve in pollution more or less held. As you developed, you cleaned up. But that doesn't hold for carbon. Like, the nature of the problems have changed. So you can't just say we should stick with the original wordings. These ideas have changed. And so the objectives, I'm probably more or less out of time, Pierre, am I?
Yeah, you are. But I mean, thanks, William. This has been, if I may, a very powerful presentation. I was wondering, I was thinking, well, while you were speaking, were you giving a presentation, whether you had given that briefing to all the OECD directors at the same time, because that conversation that you're bringing up, look at the interaction, not just at each silos. If any, it really matters for the OECD, which precisely claims to have that comprehensive role, looking from an economic perspective, where we have the economic directorate, but the tax, competition, trade, environment, not to speak employment, labor, and social affairs. You brought a lot of issues. I'm not here to make an attempt to wrap up, but I'll just pick one thing. Indeed, what you say, what I hear very often at the OECD from some corners is say, well, that's nice, but we should be evidence-based.
Yes.
And it's nice to have that conversation, but voilà. So you have this kind of no risk approach, which they stay within, no, I don't know if it's ideological, but this no risk approach to say, let's stay within the existing neoclassic framework. Because there is no evidence outside of it, so to speak. I'm simplifying a bit. I don't know, Jeff, if you are in camp, in which camp you are, whether it's camp 1, camp 2, and camp 3. I mean, I suspect you're not in camp 1 as an economist, but I'll give you the floor now, Jeff, and from there we can have a Q&A. Jeff? You need to unmute, Jeff, first.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. And hello from the TUC in London, which exceptionally I'm visiting today because I don't trust my domestic internet connection. And thank you for inviting me along. And thank you in particular to William for his very important remarks, with which I sense a lot of overlap, although I'm not going to elaborate where I think I overlap. And I suppose I want to set out a specific vision from within Camp 3, Pierre, I think is probably where I come from. Let me just try and work out. I'll just share my screen. And this vision that I'm going to set out is for what I call an internationalism of labour. To do so, I'm going to restore a class analysis of economic and political outcomes. As William's remarks exemplify, internationalism is in retreat. But I don't think the world crises are a failure of internationalism. I think they're a failure of internationalism on the terms of capital, or rather on the terms of wealth. and internationalism of labour would be built on the foundations of trade union rights and decent working pay and conditions. Financial and monetary relations between nations would operate according to a renewed Bretton Woods with speculative activity contained. Economic activity would be motivated by internal conditions with permanently low interest rates fostering private activity and supporting public spending. Rather than compete for trade in a race to the bottom, countries should cooperate or coordinate, to use William's language, for full employment and to meet the climate emergency and rise together. And I want to argue there's nothing novel in an internationalism of labour. I see the agenda evolving from at least the start of the 20th century, led by trade unions and socialist and progressive thinkers. If you actually go to the OECD report, they warn that we need to go beyond the tools of the last century. But before we do so, I think we need to better understand these tools, and in particular, the analysis and policy approach of the left and the labour movement. And I'm going to proceed in 5 sections. My point of departure will be the London dockers' strike of 1889 to emphasise internationalism as inherent to the left approach. I next will situate the analysis in a broad view of global political economy over the past century. The bulk of the discussion will then focus on elaborating the analysis and the policy approach. And I'm going to do this with a historical retrospective of the interwar period, and this will emphasise too the overlap with Keynes. The key theoretical question concerns the idea of overproduction and the relation with wealth. The analysis is then applied to explain outcomes over the century. I will close with the relation to the climate emergency. So this, which I hope you can see, is the coat of arms of the Dock, Wharf, Riverside and General Labourers Union. At the top, I hope you can see 2 figures. They represent an English and an Australian docker. And the image is set to celebrate the decisive intervention of Australian workers in the 1889 London dockers' strike. Just as the London dockers were nearly beaten, money began to pour in from the wharf labourers of Brisbane, from almost every Australian trade union, even from Australian football clubs. The grip of brotherhood the world over, the banner proclaims at the top, which I'm certain you won't be able to read. There is something pleasing and right in the solidarity among those who make trade happen across the world. In 1898, the first Congress of the International Transport Workers Federation built on this informal act of solidarity. Along with parallel political, labour and socialist internationals, the global left came together and sharpened its analytical tools. This here is Ido Fimmen from the Netherlands, who was General Secretary of the ITF from 1919 to 1942. In his 1924 book, Labour's Alternative, he observed, "The division of labour is practiced on an international scale. From moment to moment, the entrepreneurs can choose the weakest point in the international fighting front of the working class and can concentrate their attack on this." He urged workers in the West to recognise that the struggle of workers in China, Japan and India was their own struggle. The left were not only building international institutions, but right from the start understood the class conflict in international terms. Situating Fimmen's remarks is a means to review the paradigm shifts of the past century. In their report, the OECD find 2 such moments, the first in 1945 and the second in 1980. And this is sort of my characterization of the past century. And there are the 2 paradigm shifts. But I think to understand the first paradigm shift, it's important to go back a little bit to address the cause. Because Fimmen wrote, as the consequences of policy in the aftermath of the First World War were becoming increasingly apparent. These policies were prescribed by a financial elite on the behalf of the wealthy, a first internationalism of capital, if you like. Countries were instructed to restore the gold standard exchange regime in the face of economic disarray and a web of gigantic international war debts and reparation payments. As is still the norm, the arrangements were greased by large-scale international loans. Following on from the loans issued towards the end of the war, these international loans were issued with very high interest rates. The results were waves of global excess that reverted with astonishing rapidity into the Great Depression. The Depression was met with austerity, and austerity gave way to protectionism, nationalism, and eventually much worse. This is then the background for the first of the paradigm shifts in 1945. According to conventional wisdom, the world had to wait until after the Second World War, when sense finally prevailed and a new consensus was forged. I will go on to argue that the next paradigm shift basically undid the first and renewed a second internationalism of capital. Several decades on, we find ourselves back in the grey area of financial crisis and a renewed nationalist politics. The obvious call is to go back to 1945, but we can avoid the OECD fear of reinventing the past by better understanding the past. For our history books focus too exclusively on nationalist regression, when there was a sophisticated and increasingly successful left agenda. I show here a rival trajectory from Franklin Roosevelt to Leon Blum and to Clement Attlee and to early initiatives around European Union. And I now turn to these initiatives. The economics of the internationalism of labour was really very simple. Crises were a result of overproduction that resulted from power imbalance. Balance was to be restored by an internationalism of labour. This here is Ernest Bevin, the dominant figure in British trade unionism from the 1920s to his death in 1951. In a 1919 speech entitled Overproduction and the Inevitable Revolution, he set out the left's analytical stall. It's not only stunningly prescient, but also might have been written today. The great fields of exploitation of China, Japan, and the East generally will inevitably attract capital from the Western world. The world will overproduce in an intensified degree in less than 5 years from now, and will produce a world stagnation. He challenged the business people in his audience. You think the only avenue to progress and success is overseas markets. You give little or no consideration to the home market. You have little or no regard to what it means to the exchange of goods and trade with the 40 million population in your own islands. You have not realized that if you can raise the standard of life by 100 to 200%, that inevitably makes it better for all the producers concerned within your borders. It is pretty obvious that workers would be preoccupied with the relation between what they produce and what they could afford to purchase. This turns out to be the critical macroeconomic question, first posed in the 1890s by the British liberal economist John Hobson. This year, Hobson's analysis has been resurrected by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis in their aptly titled and valuable book, Trade Wars are Class Wars. And finding the answer was not only the preoccupation of the left, but also of Keynes, who brought the role of finance to bear. In practice, finance had already become obvious to Bevin. He was struck that immense interest payments to finance from firms and governments were sacrosanct, leaving the same firms and governments having to force on workers wage and job cuts. The left saw that this need not be the natural order of things. It has long been my preoccupation that the economics profession, by and large, denies, ignores, or misses Keynes's conclusion that high interest rates are the fundamental cause of economic dysfunction. His theory confirmed there were no natural rates. The authorities could set interest rates across all maturities of government debt. Devising relevant debt management and monetary policies, he saw it was imperative that the authorities set a permanent policy of cheap money. Somewhat obliquely, Keynes's general theory also affirmed trade union thinking on pay. He said that only inexperienced, unjust, or foolish persons would advocate flexible wages over flexible money. In today's language, labour market deregulation is wrong. Low interest rates coupled with actions to support pay would reset the balance between wealth and labour. Immediately, this meant nationalisation of central banks and legislation around trade unions and pay and conditions. It also meant increased government expenditure, but I stress, as only one part of the wider formula. In resetting the balance, the problem of overproduction would be resolved. Rather than too much production, the trouble all along had been too much production relative to too little purchasing power. The trick was to make the production affordable. In their 1945 manifesto, the British Labour Party went even further. Overproduction is not the cause of depression and unemployment. It is underconsumption that is responsible. It is doubtful whether we have ever, except in war, used the whole of our productive capacity. But by this time, the thinking had long been vindicated, and the formula for both domestic and for international action had been implemented. Roosevelt was the first. He built the Federal Reserve, now named the Mariner Eccles Building after the maverick banker he brought in as chairman. The modern and powerful structure was doubtless intended to be symbolic of the changed center of gravity of the monetary system to government in Washington, D.C. from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In 1937, at the dedication of the building, he spoke of the role of the monetary system in human life. That machinery must be steadily perfected to promote the most productive utilization of our human and material resources. Only in that way can we hope to achieve and maintain an enduring prosperity, free from the disastrous extremes of booms and depressions. Only in that way can our economic system and our democratic institutions survive. In parallel, Michael Savage's Labour government nationalised the Bank of New Zealand. In 1936, Léon Blum's Popular Front coalition took the Banque de France from the hands of the highest aristocracy into the hands of the public. In 1945, the first act of the Attlee government was to nationalise the Bank of England. In parallel came action on wages. Roosevelt and his Secretary of Employment, Francis Perkins, implemented the Wagner Acts. In France, Blum enacted the Matignon Accords, including a 12 to 15% wage increase, the 40-hour week, paid holidays, and the rights to full union recognition and collective bargaining. Finally, there is the international dimension, which is twofold, the practice and the theory, or perhaps even the philosophy. Roosevelt set the way to the first. At a 1933 World Economic Conference, he famously rejected the old fetishes of so-called international bankers. Instead, he supported efforts to plan national currencies. The first such initiative was the Tripartite Agreement in 1936, when the US and UK agreed to support the French currency and thus facilitate Blum's socialist programme. The culmination was at Bretton Woods, when the British government submitted Keynes's plan for an international clearing union. But the theory was no less vital, for the internationalism of labour contains a paradox. As Keynes put it in the final chapter of his general theory, if nations can learn to provide themselves with full employment by their domestic policy, there would be no important economic forces calculated to set the interest of one country against that of its neighbours. International trade would be a willing and unimpeded exchange of goods and services in conditions of mutual advantage. Oh, I don't know what happened there. In short, a truer internationalism comes from a domestic orientation. Now I want quickly to apply that theory, although I don't know why my slides are doing what they want to do rather than what I want them to do. Come back.
We can see the slide, Jeff, now.
Can you? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
it keeps jumping through.
Yeah.
Okay, so to the application of the theory, that we know we're familiar with the political shifts of the past century, but statistics offer a powerful perspective on the balance of class forces. On the left here, I show a US real interest rate as a proxy for the return to wealth. And then on the right, I show the G20 labour share as a proxy for the return to labour. The former shows material rebalancing from the 1930s and for the first decades after the Second World War. The gains are undone abruptly from the 1980s with the renewed higher return to wealth, an uncanny match to the 1920s. My chart of the labour share starts only from 1960, but is similarly undermined from the 1980s. My argument is that the golden age over the first 3 decades after the war vindicated the left analysis. Reorienting the system towards labour permitted the economy to be so much more. And for me, this is exemplified by the achievements in Britain of the Attlee government: full employment, the creation of the NHS and welfare state, building new homes, building new towns, even hosting the 1948 Olympics. But similar would be true of Europe, especially under the early initiatives of the Western European Union, and in particular the European Payments Union, that was the actual manifestation of Keynes's clearing union scheme. I'll just go back to my schematization from earlier. We can come back to inflation if you would like, but fundamentally trade unions should be celebrated for instigating the paradigm, not condemned for wrecking it. I want next to see the paradigm shift in 1979 in the class context. At this point, the balance of class forces was decisively reset towards wealth. Popular discourse celebrates the shift from market to the state, from the shift to the market from the state. But I think it is wrong that this more technocratic rather than a class-based analysis has come to define political and economic positions. We have now once more discovered that the interests of the few are wildly opposed to the interests of the many. Crises of unemployment have been succeeded by crises of living standards, with instability and insecurity the norm for the many. The rewards to the few have of course been astronomical. In technical terms, policymakers remain blindsided to repeated episodes of overproduction that culminated in the global financial crisis. For policymakers, the fault is with the public for living beyond our means. My challenge is that policymakers have forced the public to live beneath their means. With a relentless emphasis on price inflation, the real danger of debt inflation has been ignored and even is not comprehended. Under overproduction, firms are unable to sell and households are unable to afford a basic standard of living. Private debt follows as both borrow to stay afloat. Since the global financial crisis, policy has simply doubled down on error. Austerity further contains purchasing power, and subsidies to the financial sector, not least QE, likely foster further overproduction. Before the coronavirus struck, the economic and financial disarray of the world was unresolved, and many justly feared renewed crisis. So just to close, at the start, I prescribed an internationalism of labour in terms of specific policies of Bretton Woods and trade union rights and so on. In more fundamental terms, the solution is once more to rebalance the system away from wealth and towards labour. And then finally, the analysis, I think, is also relevant to climate change. At one level, a domestic orientation has obvious advantages. And let me stress too that in seeking to increase purchasing power, the aim is to sustain better production, not necessarily higher and more production. But more broadly, the internationalism of labour takes us away from natural rate thinking and the associated idea that the economy is something that exists apart from society. Chasing preordained natural rates of growth was never part of the internationalism of labour. Instead, the aim was jobs, a decent standard of life, and the right social expenditures. We could afford this because the economy was understood as the sum of what society does. We need desperately to put society back to work on the things that matter. And I think I'll stop here, and I hope I haven't overrun because I forgot to press my timer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. No, you did not spend too much time on a very dense conversation. I think we've had two different approaches here, so to speak. William, who is calling for, if I may, I'm not going to sum up your presentation, William, but You were telling us, think outside the box, look at the interactions. While Jeff, you were bringing, if I may, a lot of historical perspective and saying, well, perhaps the box is there. And what we have to discuss are, in a sense, a conversation that already was there in the 30s and in the post-war era between consumption and production. How can we build solvent, sustainable domestic demand as a overarching policy objective, as I understand. So, so very complementary contributions, if I may. We have 30 minutes together. So it's important now that I myself shut up, so to speak, and let our colleagues come in if you have questions. So at TUAC, we have a very centralized democratic process, is that you cannot take the floor alone. You need first to raise your hand, and then my colleague Gabriela will then unmute yourself. So if you're familiar with Zoom, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can see on the lower bar of your screen, there is on the participant, you can, participant button, you can raise your hand. So what do you think about it? I have Mathieu Mo from, if I may, from the ETUC, sorry, if I'm correct. Mathieu.
Yeah, thank you very much. As usual for TUAC, I take the floor. Thanks, Geoff, for reordering a little bit of history of economic thought in all these debate. You want it or not, but the future is always rooted in the past in any case. And when we were speaking about COMP1, COMP2, COMP3, I think even if you mention at the end MMT, debt issues, wealth taxation, collective bargaining as issues, you completely neglected radical Keynesianism, which at the third chapter is relegating labor market and monetary production. And you have all the school after that, which is John Robinson, Minsky, all the stock and flow model of Marc Lavoie, etc. You have all the classical economics. I'm not speaking about the invisible hand, which is not existing really in Smith. It's existing just for saying we go from sector to sector, or otherwise it's just invisible, but there is no labor market. Neither, you didn't mention the old institutionalism of Common and Veblen. You didn't mention Marxism, or also Geoff mentioned class struggle, that Schumpeter is considering as one of the only Marxist tools which is valuable. You said we are lacking evidence. Hopefully Geoff mentioned the labor share, the financial deregulation, the inequality. In fact, we can include pollution since we know that the richest are polluting the most. And just to finish, I would say that yesterday we had a very good presentation from Daniela Gabor, who made a very good sentence that we came from the welfare state to the asset-based welfare state. And I think that's where we are, in the asset-based welfare state. Therefore, I really, really support Geoff Tilley presentation, and I think we cannot just pick up from other analysis. Already the equilibrium analysis is a pure physician view of economics, and before it didn't exist. Thank you very much.
Eh bien, merci, merci Mathieu. I'll come back to you, Jeff, and William, but I would want to, do we have other, to regroup questions, comments? Do we have, yeah, Evelyn from the ITUC in Brussels. Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I really appreciated the presentations, and I really think that William Hines hit the nail on the head when he highlighted that the crisis is revealing more long-standing vulnerabilities in our system. That the trigger of this particular crisis was COVID, but the system was fundamentally weak to begin with. And suddenly in this crisis, you have governments that are acknowledging the urgency of unemployment protection for people who've lost their livelihoods, the need for paid sickness benefits, healthcare. But before this crisis, we already had only 1/3 of the world's population who had social protection. So I think now the real challenge is to encourage governments who are taking measures to address these crises, but avoiding patchwork solutions, because it's really more important than ever to rethink the prevailing economic model and examine the shortcomings of what we of what we're doing. as a little bit of promotion, I mean, I'm really interested in looking at the report that Will Heinz has mentioned. We're also coming out with a report next week, which is called What Really Matters, Measuring Government Accountability and Moving Beyond GDP. And this is looking at how policymakers have been up until now pursuing growth at the expense of a much broader range of social and environmental considerations, like quality jobs, living standards, access to health, environment, democratic rights and freedoms. And I think that this will be an interesting discussion piece to have from unions in terms of moving our economic policies in forthcoming forward to really address a much broader range of considerations, because right now, up until now, GDP growth has not been translated in increased investments in people, improved job protections, more and better jobs, and this will need to be addressed going forward.
Thank you, Evelyn. If we don't have any further questions, and I have Philippe, my colleague from TUAC. Do you want to come in? You have questions? Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you really very much, both Jeff and William, for two very dense presentations. I appreciate both of your presentations really, and I think that you're both very much tackling the current paradigm shift, where you see that the main difference is that Jeff is stressing the century or centuries-old struggle between labor and capital, and William focuses on the complexity of the economic system and on the new challenges ahead of us, so environmental crisis, digital revolution, financializations, and so forth. And starting from there, I would like to ask William, first of all, how much, taking inspiration from Jeff actually, how much of the current economic disarray is in your eyes the result precisely of a neoliberal paradigm of the past 40 years, rather than change the environmental conditions that we could again classify, label as, you know, external shocks to the economic system, like an old way of thinking. So how much is actually the result of precise policies implemented over the past 40 years? And then you also mentioned the importance of locked-in ideas and difficulty, therefore, to introduce new ways of thinking, which reminds also very much of what Keynes was writing about us being slaves, not even knowing being slaves of old dead economists' ideas. And I want to ask you, what's your impression from inside the OECD? How much the OECD is open to initiatives like TUAC? And what's your what did you achieve, in your opinion, in the past years in changing some of the points of view at the OECD, which is, from our perspective, quite rigid and basically happy to stay in their comfort zone and not change much, especially in some key departments such as the economic department, which is very much based on traditional ways of thinking, on the neoclassical model, on new Keynesianism, on DSG modeling, on supply side reform policies and stories and so forth. So how do you see that?
Thanks, Philip. Last but not least, I mean, well, we may have other questions, but before coming back to you, Jeff and William, I have Owen Tudor, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the ITUC. Owen, please go ahead.
Thanks very much for two extremely interesting presentations, and they struck me as being different because, to be honest, William was dealing more with the detail of where we live and what, you know, particular policy prescriptions in the near term, and Jeff had a much broader scale in terms of what he was suggesting. In a sense, William was suggesting a micro paradigm shift, and Jeff was suggesting a macro paradigm shift in the way that we're operating. Now, as a long-time bureaucrat, in fact, you can almost see where my old desk was in the background of where Jeff is on screen, because I sat about 20 yards behind him.
Gathering dust.
Indeed, I've always felt that I was 20 yards behind Jeff in all senses. But the key question for me is, sort of as I said, from a trade union perspective, where we very often, engage primarily with the micro, the details that we think we can change, the victories that we can manage. So my question for Jeff really is, a lot of the reason why we need the major paradigm shift he talked about, the macro paradigm shift, is because there has been, the post-war Keynesian consensus was replaced, not without struggle, during the 80s and 90s with a supply side or neoliberal consensus, which trade unions and progressive political parties, I don't want to sort of go further than that in describing them, haven't really challenged in many ways. So the question for Jeff is, how do we get from where we are now to where the political debate would need to be to see his macro shifts, if most of our effort is going to be concentrated on dealing with William's micro paradigm shifts, if that makes sense?
Thanks, Owen. I'll just add one last, and then Jeff and William, I'll come back to you. One last question. And it relates very much to William's point on moving beyond GDP, and also Evelyn of the ITUC. But Jeff, also for you, it's how do we have a good, robust measurement of data? If data is a new, my first question, is data the so-called new gold? And if so, are we confident we can measure the wealth created by data? Because if we can't measure the wealth created by data, then indeed it does pose another problem, not just for revising GDP. So it's a more technical question, but it's one that obviously matters because, as you know, we have a lot of conversation right now. They are very much at the OECD. Who wants to come in first? William, Jeff? But let's start with what? William, do you want to come in first? Yeah,
sure.
The floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much. Really interesting questions. I think just to respond to the first question, of course, I was not intending to give a comprehensive overview of all the intellectual traditions that could be drawn upon. It was a highly stylized account. But I think my main point was not to say that we should look at all of these different economic theories and, the idea that, as Keynes said, that we're slaves of the ideas of defunct economists. Well, my point was more that we're actually slaves to the ideas of defunct physicists. That the idea that we have an equilibrium system, that we have convergent dynamics. I think that's what I was trying to challenge. The idea that the system itself has become so intricate, complex, interconnected, that we need a different type of economics to really help us understand what's happening. And the example is often given that a physicist had a look at economic models in a conference once, and he said that it was like Cuba, that if you go to Cuba, you see a lot of cars on the road from prior to the blockade from the 1950s. And you have some of the best mechanics in the world in Cuba, keeping these cars on the road and really doing a great job. Great engineers, great mechanics. But the point is, and he was making the analogy to physics, that, okay, economics is a branch of physics, classical physics, but physics has changed. There are other cars now. So we don't need to stick with the cars in the 1950s. So that was more my point, less to review all of the ideas in the economic tradition. The question about what impact we've made at the OECD. Well, I think I think after the last crisis, there was a big sense that things needed to change and that there was a lot of things we didn't understand. But I think the main orientation of OECD has been, as I mentioned this camp too, to more or less fix things up And I see this again with this crisis, that the sense is we just need to get back to normal. And as the second commenter said, there were a lot of problems with the normal. So that might not be where we want to go. But the impression I get, and certainly I've heard some of our ambassadors say that, the focus should now be on getting the economy back. So, let's just fix things up and get back on the road to disaster. Well, okay, we can do that. But within the departments themselves, I think there's, I think it's less a question of ideology or that they have a set way of understanding things. I think it's a human capital problem. They've studied an economy in a certain way. They have all of this received wisdom. They have this way of understanding things. And it's very difficult for you to come along and say, well, your understanding is flawed or it's wrong. This is why the argument is that in this whole debate about economics, that the change is probably not going to come from academia, because academics can retreat into their beliefs. And the sense that why we thought the change would have to come from policymaking is that policymakers can't hide from their mistakes. They have to face the consequences. And ultimately the public, that things seem to be getting worse. There are all these problems. And so you would think that that would give us more energy to change things. But these ideas can be quite entrenched, because it's not just a matter of ideas, because as someone said, it's the models, but it's also the data we collect. We collect data with certain questions in mind, and they might give us certain answers. So the whole system is, in a sense, rigged to maintaining the current set of ideas, not to challenging them. And I think it's good that we have something like NIC, but I think ultimately Max Planck was probably right that the new ideas are not just going to be accepted. Progress is going to be one funeral at a time, or maybe one retirement at a time at the OECD. But I wouldn't underestimate the scale of the problem. It's really hard to change these sort of things. And we actually need our members, and we need the likes of TUAC to keep telling us, look at what's happening in the real world. I think the people understand, and I think the policymakers are somewhat behind them in that. So that's that. Then maybe one last thing on data. OECD prides itself on being a house of collecting comparative data and statistics. I think sometimes that can get in the way, because data is often very good at telling us where we are. But for policymakers, the real question is, where are we going to be in the future? And so a lot of our statistics are a bit too static and a bit too linear. And oftentimes they can obscure some of these changes that are happening in the system itself. So for example, how do you know if a society is going to break down? You could look at things like inequality, labor markets, you can look at economic outcomes, but that can miss some of the key dynamics of what's happening. And so data is very useful for helping us get to grips with certain problems. But there are some problems which are more conceptual and require more understanding, where the data is going to be, it's not going to be very helpful. So yeah, let's do the data and the indicators and the dashboards and the frameworks. Let's do all that, but let's also be aware that there's other ways of understanding, and we do need to think a lot more about the future, where data is not perhaps going to be much use.
Thank you, William. There was a misunderstanding. I wasn't speaking about data in the statistics sense of the term. I was talking about the rise of intangible assets, which includes both indeed data, digital data, if you want, the wealth created by that, how we measure that, but also branding, because I see it how difficult it is to, how challenging it is, Jeff. And as you mentioned, absolutely, TUAC will contribute to the economist conversation. We'll have the working group on economic policy tomorrow, virtually, and on Friday. We have trade union economists, or perhaps we have less of them within the labor movement over the past 20, 30 years, but we will make sure we can contribute. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you for the fascinating and interesting questions. I mean, basically, I'll go to Owen's point about that we haven't really challenged the existing paradigm. You know, I think we have. I think there are questions about how we make the challenge better heard. Certainly, you know, if the OECD are challenging the prevailing model, then we should be challenging the prevailing model. But you know, but this is what we've been doing with this is in part the role of TUAC, isn't it? You know, TUAC long since the financial crisis began to challenge what was going on. We hosted a meeting, I can't even remember when it was, 2 years ago. And I've dug out the conclusion of that meeting. We hosted a meeting in London to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the TUC and the 70th anniversary of TUAC. The conclusion was populism and anti-politics are a reaction to this, but instead of an inward-looking agenda, the solution must come from the global stage. To foster global debate on an alternative approach, the global trade union movement has a key role to play. And I think, in a way that with the crisis global, it kind of goes beyond individual national trade union centres, and it is almost inherently, the ball is inherently placed in TUAC's court and the ITUC's court. So I think it's incredibly important that the international trade union institutions develop this narrative, as I'm sure Pierre may come back to as well. You know, to develop an alternative narrative that builds on what other institutions are doing. I'm involved in various outfits that say similar things to the OECD, and I like the way Owen characterised the sort of micro and the macro views. But I think that the micro vision that the OECD are outlining is one that is more compatible with the macro view of a Keynes or whatever, or the left. You know, it's a micro view that gets away. Well, maybe this is a question for William, that gets away from the idea that the economy is the sum of the parts of lots of individual actions, but that is something more different. So I think the debates are happening. The international arena is the right place for these things to happen. Perhaps we need to think about how to, once we have the narrative in place at the international level, how we translate that into the more domestic level. And then I think just lastly, you know, you have to come back to it. You know, so someone told me that my remarks were my kind of narrative is a bit pie in the sky, but in a way, it seems to me that you need pie in the sky at the moment, because the world is so far from where it should be. You know, the crisis, the economic crisis is so, you know, prior to COVID, the economic crisis was so deep, the world was so fragile, and the political crisis was no less deep. So, you know, if this isn't the time to think, you know, big, and to think of big new models, or to need big new models, then I don't know when it is, basically.
Thanks, Jeff. Before closing, we have two droits de réponse, we say in French. I see that Owen and Mathieu would want to take the floor again. Who wants? And John, and John Evans, I see also. So let's start with Mathieu. I think you were first, and then Owen, and then John Evans.
Just to remark for saying that already the radical Keynesian were saying that the system was intrinsically unstable. So it's not like a novelty to think that the system is not stable. And second, I'd like to go also to Owen's remark. I think you're not good enough with yourself, if I could say. During the 70s, I'm learning at university that the 70s, it's called the revenge of Hayek over Keynes. And if I'm not wrong, during the 70s, you had huge strikes in the United Kingdom. So you tried to resist quite a lot, and you were not helped clearly by Thatcher, who even at the House of Lords said, please read Hayek, Law, Legislation and Liberty. So I think, in fact, you resisted more than what you said.
Thanks, Mathieu. Owen, you want to come in? Owen, we should be able to unmute you. Nobody wants to unmute you. I thought you were weird.
Yeah, no, okay. Someone has. Sorry, I was getting a message saying the host does not want to unmute you, which suggests that the host has a certain amount of common sense. Mathieu is right, and sorry, I probably sent Jeff off slightly down the wrong hole by being too self-critical of the trade union movement, but I didn't want to leave us out. That sort of, we haven't perhaps sometimes fought hard enough or more or clearly enough. The real question that I really wanted to pose was, why aren't social democratic parties doing this heavy lifting? Because that's where we've really had problems with getting these sorts of political debates going, is that, yeah, trade unions do every so often. We say, yeah, the whole thing's completely useless. Is the problem? And then you have social democratic governments coming back and saying, oh, yeah, we've got to balance our budgets and we've got to have free trade and we've got to, all that sort of stuff. That's where we've been failing. And okay, so maybe the criticism of us, the self-criticism of us, is we have not persuaded even social democratic parties to challenge the status quo. It is worth remembering, of course, in terms of Jeff's sort of, I don't know, it's not an obsession, it's a concentration on Keynes. Is worth noting, Keynes wasn't a social democrat. He was a member of the Liberal Party in the UK, and it's worrying that we had sort of some of our greatest success influencing him rather than influencing socialist and social democratic parties around the world. And I know they've got a difficult job on, of but so that was my real question, is why haven't social democrats done this?
Very good question, Owen. Thanks. John Evans, if you can take the floor. We can. Yeah, you are mute now. Please go ahead, John.
Thanks very much, and thanks to really interesting presentations, and Pierre and you and TUAC for setting this up. I had one question for both Jeff and William, and one more specifically for William. I mean, the general question is, why was it that the neoclassical synthesis became the standard paradigm even before the paradigm shift of Thatcher, and why was it that became what was being taught in universities, particularly in North America and other parts of the what the French would call the Anglo-Saxon world? And why couldn't it have been a neo-institutionalist paradigm plus Keynes, which in a way, I mean, all of the arguments against general equilibrium theory and else were put forward in the end of the 19th century. So why did that win, as it were, and what would it take to change it now? The second question is more to explore William, how he sees this playing out in the OECD thinking. Somebody once said to me some years ago, the OECD was basically the economics department and treasuries set the intellectual center of gravity. And there are certain tram lines outside that intellectual center of gravity, which other departments and other people in the OECD can step outside. But if they do that, they really have to know what you're doing. So staying within that conventional wisdom at the OECD was the way you actually got promoted and got on. Now, looking at your Camp 1, I mean, that's pretty much, echo. Camp 2, you can see a few other departments adding adjectives to the growth paradigm and bolting on a few bits and pieces. But the question is there any real rethinking going on, in your view, inside the economics department and treasuries about where this is all going in the future, which seems to be the core of really shifting this into a more fundamental, radical shift in the OECD? Thanks,
John. Time is limited, but I would want Jeff and William, if you could contribute and comment before we close this webinar. Jeff, do you want to start first?
Okay, so I meant to come back to Mathieu's point about radical Keynesianism and institutionalism and whatnot. I see the debates neck. Radical Keynesianism has essentially become mainstream, and I think sometimes it's unfortunate that it's not acknowledged that this paradigm has existed for a long time, that's challenged conventional wisdom, and there's a lot of aspects of it are being sort of reinvented. Then just lastly on Keynes and Marx and the Liberal Party, and on Owen's point about the political parties, that, yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, and it's beyond my pay grade. I think Keynes is interesting in this. You know, Owen made the point that he was a liberal, but I think it might be quite helpful to invent or remind ourselves that Keynes was very important for the left as well. And because, you know, there's this sort of, it's all false oppositions, isn't it? It's you're either a Marxist or you're not, or something. And Keynes tends to be put on the side of the capitalist, but I think, you know, he may belong more closely on the side of the left, and maybe his role is more important on the side of the left. Just to John's point about you know, why did we go for the neoclassical paradigm? I think I would say that was class. I would say that the elites across the world, including academic elites, didn't want that. They wanted to restore a more hardline economic environment that harked back before the welfare state, before everything else. So I fear it was class forces that were ultimately decisive in what paradigm prevailed after Keynesianism.
Thanks, Jeff. William.
Yeah, well, thanks. Great questions. It wasn't really aimed at me, but maybe I just comment on the social democratic parties. It is amazing that a lot of the premises of social democracy have more or less been accepted during this crisis. And yet only, like, the state has an obligation to look after people. This has really been reinforced by this crisis. But there seems to be, with social democratic parties, essentially, a lack of courage of conviction, which, you know, and I think this feeds into the economics as well, that, you know, why did this school of thought win out in this Darwinian contest? I think economic thinking can change during crises, or when certain approaches show to have failed. And in the 1970s, I think with stagflation and all of these economic problems, it was shown, it was a sense that these policies had failed and therefore alternatives were needed, and stagnation was the theme. And so we needed to turbocharge the growth process. And so I think there was a demand. And I think people believed that these new policies would give better answers, and economic growth seems sensible. But I think now there's also a sense that the Keynesian ideas, again, a lack of courage of conviction, sense that, yeah, actually there are flaws in our idea, we need to fix these things up. And that's now happening with the neoclassical approach. So there's an opportunity to say, well, is it about fixing the failures in the existing model, or do we need a new model? And that's, I think, the debate. Will it happen at the OECD? I think the way you categorize the OECD is accurate. I think we're still dominated by finance ministries, but I think it has changed since the financial crisis in a sense, because of just the importance of the other issues like digitalization, like the environmental crisis. And in a way, I think certainly in the visibility of OECD, the economics department has become somewhat peripheral. Like they keep doing their economic surveys and they're churning out their policy related research. But when we look at the main thrust of the OECD, I think it's other areas. I think it's tax, it's education. And so there's, in a sense, a loss of leadership because they don't really have big answers on big questions. They have, you know, let's just monitor and look at the structural policy settings. And that's the way they think about an economy. But as we saw in Chile recently, you know, according to the economic survey, everything is fine. The policy settings are really good. One of the great reformers in the region, but then your society collapses. So we can't rely on the economics department alone.
Yeah.
And I do think we need to join these things up. I think it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Thanks. Thanks, William. We'll have to close this webinar regarding the economic survey. It so happened that it says these surveys are produced or delivered by one committee, one of 200 committees at the OECD, called the EDRC, the Economic and Development Review Committee, which is the only committee at the OECD where there is no access no transparency, no flow of information to both TUAC and BIAC. Just happened that way. And so sometimes, but that's my personal view, I wonder how those recommendations are being built. It's either indeed no risk, neoclassic approach, or sometimes a bit of a bargaining, if I may, with the government. But that's another conversation. Thanks to all of you. I added in the chat, we're not here to make the promotion of the OECD. The OECD does it alone. But as we spoke about William's and the Nike initiative on the latest report on Beyond Growth, I just added the URL. For our dear colleagues, you will know this was a kind of warm up, if I may. We'll have the TUAC working group on economic policy, which tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday as well. And we will actually continue the conversation that we're having on Friday. I think it's at 12:30. CET, Continental European Time, where we have a session on a new trade union economic narrative. If you've been on our website, on our members website, you'll see we have a draft narrative, draft manifesto, which are TUAC papers that we've been maintaining and improving, obviously now in light of the crisis. It's an initiative that's, as Jeff mentioned, which actually flows from the London meeting that we held in November 2018. With that, I will close this webinar. I would like to thank Jeff, thank William, thank to all the participants, thanks to Philip Stefanovic of the TUAC who's been organizing this webinar. I wish you, I'll just say bon courage à vous tous, and for many of you, I give you, I hope to see you actually tomorrow and on Friday for our working group in economic policy. Thank you.